try to do is to really move the discussion now more towards not just global trends, but really how, within that context, all of us as art institution builders work, should work, and function. As Darren mentioned when we first started talking about that, one of the things that I must say, not just as the head of the Asian Society, but as somebody who's been in the arts and culture field for a long time, felt that it was really important that we understand mega trends on the one hand and how culture plays a role in it. Because often when we talk about globalization, the first things that come up are geo-economic. Businesses have been doing it for a while. Geopolitical, something that we also think about. But I was very struck when Khalid was talking, is that when it comes to culture, just think of a Tahrir Square. Why is it that what he was talking about we never heard on our televisions, on our communication? Because often arts and culture don't get the kind of priority that they deserve, that they need to have. It's partly because the trends are often as if culture reflects what geopolitical and geoeconomic situations would be. But as we learned this morning, I think arts have a very special capacity. And to me, the reason arts and culture really become central to this kind of seismic shifts that are going on in the world is that arts have the capacity to both be of a place and transcend a place. They have a capacity to be off a time and transcend time, because it's that creative space that goes beyond history, anthropology. It's about that, and it is more. And it's that space that we must really pay attention to as arts institution builder. Before I go to our wonderful distinguished panelists, let me also just say that just think of two phenomenon in the year 2050. One is that more than 50% of the world's GDP will come from India and China alone. And as the Chinese friends would say, we're back again. Last 250 years were just the exception. This was circa 1700, this was the reality, and we're moving to that reality again. And the other one is that more than 50% of the world's population will come from those two parts of the world, and that's earlier than 2050. As Fareed Zakaria has mentioned, in fact, it is something about thinking about this multipolarity of the world, where the last 250 years of geo-economic, geo-cultural, geopolitical supremacy of Euro-American axis is going to change. And it's huge. How does that affect us in cultural sphere is one of the discussions that we want to have with this panelist. And we also want to think about its implications for our work. How do we work? How do we change how we work? And that's one of the things that we want to talk about. To help us shape this discussion, we have four very distinguished panelists. I want to start with Aisha Al-Khattar, and she's the acting director of the Doha Museum of Islamic Art. And you all have their bios. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'm going to give you something special about each one of them. Aisha is also a musician and a sports person. Victor Menezes is the retired senior vice chair of Citi, and I know that some of you might say, okay, why do you have a corporate guy here? The reality is that Victor embodies globalization in the work he has done. He also happened to be my former vice chair of the Asian Society board, and he's one of the persons that I always felt I learned a lot from about thinking about global picture and how do we function. He also happens to be a passionate collector of Gandhara art, which is early Buddhist art from the subcontinent. Pune Prim is the director, executive director of the Living Arts of Cambodia, and for him, his passion is using the arts in the landscape of social entrepreneurship, especially in his country, Cambodia. Michael Kaiser is no stranger to any of you, the president of the Kennedy Center, and the reality is that he's often known as a turnaround guru for cultural institutions, but most importantly, his passion is teaching. So let me start, Aisha, with you. And that is that when we talk about this idea of globalization, of course, UAE, Doha, Qatar come right in the middle of it. You have single-handedly, the region has single-handedly now created kind of a cultural hub. Some people would say that by having an IMP design building, Jean Nouvel, Frank Gehry, that essentially you're importing Western models to create new buildings. How do you, as a person in that region, think about this interaction of local, regional, global? What does that mean, especially when it comes to the region?
Well, I think the idea of importing Western, first of all, Western architects, I think it is part of Qatar's vision of globalization, becoming a global culture, is bringing that connection of West and East, and really encouraging this multicultural attitude and the tolerance between the nations. And I think this is a perfect example. First, within the building itself that will house the collections. I mean, we bring in the Western architects, but the inspirations are all locally, or from local inspirations or regional inspirations. And we then house the collections. Unlike many Western museums, our collections are really mostly local, or have something to do with the local culture.
It is for the Museum of Islamic Art.
It is absolutely for the museum. I mean, this is the first museum that was built in Qatar. It actually has not a single object from Qatar, but it is very closely related in terms of the religious aspect. It spans from Spain to China, the collections, but it obviously crosses the Arabian Peninsula. The next.
Who is it for? Who is this institution for? The institutions that are being built, and how does it work with the local community?
I mean, it's absolutely for the people of Qatar, and I'm not talking only about the national people, because Qatar is only 1.6 million people, right. And the locals only make 20% of that number. The other 20% is Arab nationals. 60% are actually the labor force, which mainly come from Southeast Asia
and South Asia, sure.
And South Asia. So. It is for the people, the expats of Qatar, the tourists, and for the world, really, because we aim to have our collections not only to be physically seen, but to have them available to the world digitally as well.
So that it seems to me that you're trying very hard to create this kind of not so much a melting pot, but at least confluence of different traditions coming in together. Victor, in terms of the corporate world, as I've often said, that Citi was global before the word global became part of our common parlance for more than 100 and some years. And you started out in India, but one of the things that I think it would be interesting for our audiences to hear is from your experience, what is the difference between international and global? And how do we think about the changes that are going on now that are different from the way we thought about the world 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Well, international and global first. I mean, I think a lot of companies, a lot of institutions think of themselves as international, which is we come from a certain place and we export or we sell or we collaborate with people all over the world. And we're from New York and we're here to help you.
We know that one. That's true.
I think the true global companies operate as local companies all over the world and learn how to create networks. I think one of the great opportunities in the cultural world as well as in the business world is how can, in fact, we can create these networks that can really expand the culture and expand our thinking. And to do that, I think there's something required which let's call cultural bandwidth. I think the people have to develop an ability to deal with Argentines and Germans and Thais and Brazilians and come into a room and sort of work them together to a common purpose. Nobody teaches you cultural bandwidth in school or any other place. And I think one of the key things of cultural institutions is, can you in fact expose people? Because we are living in a global world, we're not going to go back. Right. And that's the way it's going to be. Now, all art is local, but there are global trends that involve the transmission of art that creates a lot of the art. I mean, it's the Flanders-Florence connection that created a lot of the Renaissance art. And you can say the same thing about music or sculpture or anything else. And how do you connect these networks is what's going to create, I think, the spark of creativity.
So one of the things that Ed Norton was talking about in the first panel is this idea of role of the arts in education, that part of it is not just about creativity, but it's also cultural literacy, that we as cultural institutions haven't always thought about as what we can do, especially those of us who have been part of encyclopedic collections. Pluyun, for you, it seems to me that here you are a nascent organization representing that in a country that has come out of a huge conflict zone, and at the same time you're thrust into the global arena. How do you manage this? You know, Victor was talking about the difference between international and global is not just simply that I know how best to do it, which we in the West know really how to do, but that you're also trying to come up with the local infrastructure, local ideas. What does that mean for you from the Cambodian perspective?
Because also I'm serving somehow in that kind of bridge, because I was born in Cambodia and grew up in the West.
Montreal, right.
And went back 13 years ago in a time where the country was rebuilding itself. And it's very particular because, you know, what I went through, my own journey, it's really going back to what is identity and what is value. And the work that, you know, we have done particularly was, you know, the last 10, 15 years was around restorations, preservation. And somehow like a kind of rescue missions of how you get the traditional form that the country had, but then also how then you connect that to the youth populations. How do they connect when they were not at all connected, because there's this whole gap of the society, and, you know, under 25 years old, it's 50% of the populations are under 25 years old. So this has been a really challenging time for the country. But I think, you know, for me, it's the way I envision somehow this global and local issue is the hope that the young population is creating. It's where we have to work on. But it's how you connect them with their own identity and culture. And, you know,
is it because partly the younger people in Cambodia today already feel like they want to be part of the world, and here you are trying to preserve something that's very specific? Do you feel the tension between the two?
I don't feel the tension. I think there's a lack of information. I think there's a lack of opportunity, and this is what we have to create. You know, Joyce this morning was talking about identity and values, and I thought it was really strong because, you know, coming from Kenya, I felt connected to what she was telling, and it's exactly what I hear when I speak with the master who survived the genocide, and with the youth who want to understand what were their past. So I think this is where, you know, the work that we have to do. It's really bridging that relationship.
Michael, you have been all over the world working with people, especially in Africa, and this idea of local, global that Victor was talking about and Pluyun is talking about. How does that manifest itself when you work with African museums and Performing Arts Center? Do you find that part of it is kind of the old notion of internationalist attitude? We in the West have developed these institutions for a long time. You do have something to teach. And how do you marry that with what the local needs are? And what are the things that you feel you have really learned from that experience?
I think I try and not approach it that I'm coming to a country with things to teach. Rather, I think in every country I visit, there's a huge fear about where the money's going to come from. You know, if you go outside the European model to much of the rest of the world, and if you take the Gulf aside,
right.
the money's not coming from the government.
Right.
There's, I think, a mistaken notion that everywhere else in the world the money comes from the government. I was just visiting 5 African nations in February, and in not one of those countries was the government a substantial supporter of the arts. And so the real desire...
Where is the money coming from?
Well, in many cases now, in Africa particularly, it's coming from Scandinavian governments and German government. But that's not going to last, because right now every European government's being forced to cut its arts funding at home. And so their funding for the arts around the world, I think, is going to shrink. And so there's this tremendous fear. And so rather than it's my coming as an imperialist saying, let me bless you and teach you, it's much more people saying, help us, how do we raise some money? And I
Is
think
that the crucial question for them?
absolutely. And I think I always say that the reason why we in America know about fundraising has to do with our own national embarrassment, which was that we were founded by the Puritans who thought music and dance were evil. And therefore we
And
had
how often we forget that.
and therefore we
history.
had a separation of art and state. That's not something to be proud of. And we've had to therefore, if we were going to have art, and every society wants art, we had to find a different alternative method, and we perfected, in quotes, this method of finding resources outside of government structure. That, I believe, is becoming a more realistic model, not in full, but in part, in many, many countries, Europe, including European countries. And so there's this tremendous desire for information rather than feeling that someone's coming to tell them how to do it.
Do you feel you've learned something in that process
Oh,
for your work? Tell us about that.
for me, I think, I really think that, at least I can only speak for myself, but I feel they're probably true for others in my field in this country, is we get a little bit jaded. And I think sometimes we're so busy and so fearful about resources and how we're going to pay for art and how we're going to fulfill the desires of our audiences and desires of our board and desires of the press, and that sometimes I think there's a certain spirituality that at least I have lost until I travel across the world. And I see art that is being created for art's sake, not for institutional advancement. And when I went to...
Or art for society's sake,
For society's
which is what
sake.
we were hearing from the first panel.
I remember so well being in Islamabad and going to a Sufi music festival. Now, I didn't know anything about Sufi music until I went to this festival. And you hear these incredibly virtuosic performers, just the most astonishing singers you've ever heard in your life. They could be on the stage of any opera house, just they do different repertory. And you realize they're singing from their heart and they're singing from their soul. And it really does make you reevaluate, why are you in this field? So for me, I think that's what I get the most from traveling around.
Yeah, and in fact, Leon, this is something I thought you might have something to say about that.
Yeah, yes, I think it's very interesting what you just said is also, we have in that globalization or internationalizations that you talked about is the border where I think emerged from this developing country is there's a strong sense of rituals and ceremonies, and with the development of tourism, in fact, this becomes something that people want to see. And the challenge is where you keep the character and I think the context of why these arts or this culture has emerged in terms of ritual, in terms of ceremony, and really spiritual things, but also the challenges of how economical development impact that. And people were saying make it shorter or repeat it, and it become it's commodified. It's commodified the arts and the traditions. And this is also the danger where globalizations tend somehow to almost kill the arts and the culture.
Well, some people would say it kills the art. Some people might say, well, if without that, would it survive? And that's the issue, right?
I've been here for a month, really working in terms of we came with this project about bringing Cambodian arts to New York scene. And when I was talking to people, I say, why New York? Why do you want to do that? And speaking also to the artists in Cambodia is why you want us to be abroad? And the challenge is that for me it was natural to say, well, yeah, if we want to see, people have to see Cambodia not through the eyes of the killing field or the genocide, but through the eyes of the arts. And I was just trying to convince them, and people was just saying that yes, but be careful, because also we don't want to completely change who we are. And this is the challenge, is when I have a meeting with Lincoln Center or with Brooklyn Academy of Music, is then suddenly you're taking sacred dance, or you're taking thousands of years old rituals, and you want New Yorker to experience that, but also you want to pay respect to what are the traditions.
Well,
these are the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, when Khalid was talking about Tahrir Square, and Leslie was the one who asked the question, that art is happening in public spaces today. Art is also happening at Sufi shrines. And what do we as institutions do to try to preserve some essence of it, but be aware that it can't be the same? And at the same time, the centrality of the arts in many non-Western traditional cultures has been profound. And how do we continue to manage that? Victoria, when it comes to arts and culture, and you've been in Latin America, Mexico, Korea, as well as India, and now in the United States, when it comes to support for the arts, today one would say that actually the support for the arts even in America is dwindling. It's not just simply that African countries have a problem, but how do you see the pattern of support for the arts from the corporate side of the world, and whether you feel there is some tension now that as you become more localized, there are local needs that are often seen as more paramount, whether it's education, hunger, literacy, et cetera, et cetera. How should the cultural institutions make a case for why the arts are so important, even to the corporate or to the other communities?
Can I come back to that and just respond to? One of the things that we can get mesmerized with is diversity of what we're talking about. And the same thing applies in banking. But the reality is about 80% of people's attitudes towards money is pretty similar around the world. And I suspect that
it's like our DNA, right? 99% is the same.
I suspect that applies to attitudes about art as well. So the trick is, how do you find the common elements that people think about and want, and how do you play to that? And I think there's more commonality in there than most people would readily admit to. So I think part of the answer is leverage. How can we in fact use the business world, the companies and governments, to more effectively support the arts, to more effectively support the diversity that's there in arts. And I think trying to figure out the funding patterns, trying to figure out the difference between hardware and software. I mean, there's a lot of focus, I think, as Michael, you pointed out once, about building opera houses and building museums and building wonderful structures, but not enough focus in terms of the software or the artists that go into that. And getting that right, getting that mix right is something I think that both the arts world and the business world can help put together.
Yeah, so the hardware and the software relationship, especially in developing countries, is a really huge problem.
Yeah. If I could just give a couple of examples of that, I do a lot of work in the Arab world, and I was in Riyadh about a year ago, and I was brought to see their cultural center, the King Fahd Cultural Center. And you drive out, and it's in the middle of nowhere. There's no way to get there, but it looks like Versailles, in an Arab version of Versailles, with marble and it's just gorgeous, crystal chandeliers. But when you step on the carpet, you crunch because it's never been used. It's 15 years old. They've never had a performance in it, and it was built because Saudi Arabia should have a cultural center. And then another example from the same country, Saudi Aramco, the oil company, is building a world-class, truly astonishing cultural center in Dhahran, which is on the eastern half of Saudi Arabia. And they've hired Snøhetta from the Scandinavia to design it. It's a beautiful contemporary facility. But when I asked them what their operating budget was, they said, well, it's not going to cost anything because it's going to be run entirely by volunteers. And so I think there's a lot of there's a lot of lack of understanding on the government side. I'm talking particularly here about what makes art. What is art? Is it a facility or is it the work that in the facility? And I think that disparity is very important in many, many countries of this world.
Well, I mean, in China, government has said that in Shanghai alone, they're going to build 100 new museums. And one of the things that when I had a chance to talk to the Shanghai mayor, and we said, so what are you going to put in it? I said, oh, we'll figure that out. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the issues that's a flip side of this kind of globalization, is that people do think about museums, cultural institutions, as symbol of having arrived. Yeah. Yes. But then what? And it seems to me that obviously in Doha, you have some of these issues as well. And how are you, from Qatari side, actually dealing with it? Because what Doha and Qatar do are a little bit different, it seems to me, from Abu Dhabi. And so it might be interesting to get at that nuance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think cultural institutions in the Gulf have slightly become a trend or a fashion, right. But in Qatar, I think we're building it in a different way. I mean, we did initially, it was about the building, it was about the collection. The thought of, or about the opening of the museum. Right. It was a grand opening, and then what happens next? No one talks about that. Where's the staff that are going to operate this? But we managed to catch it in time, I think. We have, obviously, we have Western expertise and experience, where the curatorial staff, so a lot of the operations staff as well. But the model that we're using now is kind of the shadowing model. Actually, I was saying to my colleagues here earlier that, I'm a perfect example. Right. Coming into the museum world, we have no understanding of what a museum is. I'm a local Qatari. And what happens I've seen museums in the West, been in them, but like my mother asks me now, what do you do on a day-to-day basis? If the objects are in the showcases, that's the work done. But
some of our parents ask the same question.
So the shadowing experience for myself. I entered the museum into the events department. The chairperson asked me to join the museum. Had no idea of what I was going to do there. But I entered in the events department to create programs for the museum in terms of music as well as arts. But I actually fell in love with the objects. I then pursued that, shadowed the two directors actually. And this is the model that we're using. We're getting local Qataris, getting either from high school or newly graduates, and having them, shadow the registrar, shadow a curator, become a researcher for a couple of years, and develop a training program, so that in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, we will have this turnover of, I hate to see Western staff completely disappear, because right. I love this multicultural organizations that we have.
You see, that's the other issue. I think that, in fact, we might learn something from the corporate world, even though I don't feel like corporate world has necessarily got all the answers. But this idea of talent development, and what are the things, Victor, that we might learn as all of us, even in this room, are thinking about truly becoming more global or globally sensitive, while we also pay attention to our local needs, is the issue of talent development. And are there things that you feel the corporate world has done right, and what are the things they have not done right that we can learn from?
Well, first of all, talent is pretty evenly distributed. The trick is, how do you find it around the world and create an opportunity for people to train themselves, develop, and rise. And that's really a tough thing to do, but really a tremendously satisfying thing to do. I think, for example, creating a culture where differences are respected, and in fact diversity, cultural diversity is respected, where people feel they can rise, providing training, providing global interactions, those are all key parts of building an organization. And I think as the arts world thinks, how do you spread out? Being able to source people from around the world and bring them into a common culture.
And even our own diversity in this
Absolutely.
country, which I think is just as equally important. I must say that one of the things when I was part of the Association of Art Museum Directors with Arnold Lehman and some of the other friends is the fact that art museum world, for example, or most of our cultural spheres still are not diverse enough in terms of the top leadership, and how do we deal with that? A very little anecdote where a colleague of mine who's in London, a Bangladeshi, and I was doing a speech there, and he was with the former Lehman Brothers, senior guy. And I asked him, I said, how much of your cultural identity do you think you bring to work? He looked at me and he said, nobody's ever asked me that question. And then he said, maybe 5%. That's talking about respecting differences, where if you are expected to mold into a given form, rather than actually celebrating the differences that we bring to the table, it seems to me is a real challenge for all of us. Michael, thought on that?
I think we're so far behind the corporate world in developing talent that I think that issue is sort of up here, and we still have a lot of work to do down there of finding and training people to run our organizations. And I think there's, what I've been lucky enough to find in my work is astonishingly talented people all over the world, but just thirsting for training. Yeah. There is so little arts management training anywhere in this world. And it's, to me, the greatest fear I have for the whole arts ecology. I see no lack of talent of artists, but I see such a lack of talent of trained managers who can allow the artists to do their work and support that work.
And having the content and the management skills to really take it to another level. We're going to open it up to the audience, and thoughts, questions, comments. Please identify yourself and wait for the microphone. There's a hand right there, and then we'll come back on this side.
Is it on? Okay. I'm Michael Royce from the New York Foundation for the Arts, and I think it's really great that these other countries are building or have built these institutions to symbolize, if you will, the importance of culture. I think that's terrific. But I'm also wondering, what are these countries doing to build an infrastructure for the individual artists who don't necessarily want to be part of these buildings?
Pluyun and Michael. Yes, Pluyun, why don't you take that?
Yes, I think the issue that, example, if in the case of what I've worked with Cambodian artists and individual artists, is again the notions of when these young emerging artists were coming from is we didn't have institutions, we didn't have Asia Society or Kennedy Center, but we created School Without Walls within the community. So it came, all these individual artists really came from local community and emerging. What is their challenge is, I think after that, is how do they pursue what they are initiating? How do we create an environment for them to really be able to continue their work? To find a market, to find public to come and watch the performances. So I think we, in the case of what I am working on, is really, and I shared that with Aisha, and she said, we have to build the public because the public have to understand that first. And it's again, it's going backward and thinking about arts and education, how important is, in preparations of the long-term visions of, how you build the arts and how you sustain the arts, and is how also the community and the people really understand that, and the importance of arts and education. And I think Michael, regarding the question is, I think for other countries, the infrastructure, most of them in developing countries we don't have that kind of infrastructure.
Yeah. We need this appreciation, and I mean, and I'm talking about Middle East countries. That's not there, it's missing. So, I mean, like Pluyun said, it's the foundation we need to build. And at the moment in Qatar, that's what's missing. I think they're building it from top to bottom.
How to go from the other way around is a much bigger issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, arts and music is not, I mean, I'm talking public schools, is not taught at all.
Right.
It is taught in international schools. I was raised, I studied in an international school, and I think, you know, if it was the other way around, I started in a public school, I might have not developed that interest in music or the passion for it. So, you know, we need to really work from the bottom up and develop that respect.
And I think one thing that one needs to understand is in many, many countries that are building these palaces of culture, they're not like American arts organizations which do an art form or which have necessarily even a producing element within it. They are essentially presenting organizations or really just housing organizations. I was just in Trinidad last month. The Chinese government just built them an $800 million performing arts center in Trinidad. But there's no producing element within it. So actually, it does support the local artist because any local artist who wants to do any performance can essentially have free access to the building because there's nothing in the building. So I think, you know, we tend to think of a Metropolitan Opera House or the Signature Theater. We tend to think of organizations which are producing, but in this case, what's being built really are just facilities, and so there's nothing in those facilities.
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting about that question is that there are some countries like Malaysia or Singapore, you might have a rental gallery, and artists can rent that space for just their work, which within the American context we would find objectionable. But I would say, speaking from the perspective of the Asian countries I know, even countries that have very rich artistic heritage, such as India, and the government has done a lot, there are artist associations and things like that. I think within the educational system, there is such a deprivileging of arts and humanities. And I hate to say it, but here is Victor, product of IIT, Indian Institute of Technology. If you're the smartest kid, where do you go? Math and science, and go to those areas. So if you happen to be with an artistic temperament, there's almost deprivileging of that because people would say, oh, what are you going to do, you know? And so I can tell you that even to this day, I get calls from young Indian Americans or Pakistani Americans or Korean Americans who want to intern at the Asian Society, and they say, will you please talk to my parents that it's okay to be in the arts and humanities, that there is something there? And I think that this is an issue. It's sort of, how do we get arts and culture to be central to our life? And I would say to some extent, Rocco and Ed, what you're talking about, we have to do that here too. We have to remind people that to be human is to mean to be culturally sensitive and to be artistic. And how do we make that case? I think that's an issue all over the world, even in developing countries.
I travel around this country, and I'm often asked, what's your real job? We know that you're the president of Kennedy Center, but what do you really do?
Yeah, like, is this a paid job?
Yeah,
do people
exactly.
say, is this your full-time job? Mm-hmm. People ask all the time. Yeah. There was a hand back over there, yes. And then Lowry will come back to you. Yeah, sorry, yes.
Hi, Bill Bragan from Lincoln Center. There was a lot of talk this morning about the role of the internet and social media in terms of the way that ideas have been able to move really fluidly around the globe and the role in globalization there. But there's also so much talk here about the importance of the local and the physical space. And I think to Michael's point about as these buildings are being built and they need to present artists, and there's not necessarily the local artist tradition or population to fill them. I'm wondering about the impact of immigration and visa policies, not only in terms of bringing artists within the United States, but traveling throughout the world as you're seeing borders in certain ways becoming more rigid at the same time that the information itself is becoming more fluid.
Michael, since you have lots of recent experience on this.
It's a huge problem in every direction. It's a huge problem, obviously, to get artists into this country. We did a festival of Arab culture 2 years ago. It took us 18 months to do the visa process for the 900 performers we brought to this country. But it's also, as you mentioned, hard from country to country. I do a lot of work in Palestine, and it's extremely difficult, obviously, for Palestinians to get out of Palestine and to be able to travel even to Europe, or not forgetting the United States, just getting that kind of exchange. But my first experience with the work you're talking about, the problems you're talking about, was when I did a lot of work in South Africa in the 1990s, in the middle 1990s. During the cultural boycott, there was a cultural boycott of South Africa. And going to South Africa, my first trip there was just as that was ending. The lack of cultural exchange had been so damaging, particularly in art forms like contemporary dance, where there has been absolutely no Western and South African interchange, or Eastern and South African interchange on contemporary dance. And it's been so interesting to watch. Now it's 15 years later, and to see how the contemporary dance world of South Africa has just blossomed because of the borders being opened up. And for me, that's really been an education about the need to allow really free movement of artists. And it's not just on the internet. Internet's a help, but it's not enough. You have to have dancers talking to dancers, and singers talking to singers, and all kinds of interchange across boundaries. And when you do that, the impact and the quality of art is really astonishing.
Victor wanted to say a word. Yeah.
I'm more of a banker than an artist, but think of the architecture of the two institutions. If you go back 100 years, banks were built to look like big banks with colonnades and steps and temples. Museums are still built that way. At the end of the day, people don't want to visit a bank branch. They want to be able to deal with their money. And the same thing is true of art. And I think that's where technology will play a bigger and bigger role, that these institutions will be able to share through technology.
Absolutely.
Create more possibilities than ever existed before.
That's great.
But the old building, I think, is maybe a thing of the past.
But I think the other thing for us to think about is going back to Victor's earlier point about international versus global. So I think many of us have been involved in the import-export model of the arts. We've brought stuff out and we've taken that in, and we've dealt with the visa problems and everything else. I think the next frontier for us is to really think about true collaboration. Collaboration that's deep, that's connected, that really allows people, both physically and virtually, to do things together. And I still feel that the parity and respect that we need to have for both sides, I don't think is there. And I think that's the next frontier that all of us have to think about. What does that mean in order to create a different kind of global community as we go forward? Lowry had a hand, and then I'll come back to the back. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah. Hello, my name's Bert. I'm from an arts organization in Divine Providence in the tiny little state of Rhode Island. And I think I'm reinforcing what you're saying. I don't think it's about north, south, east, or west. I think it's about what art's going to look like in a smaller world. I think it's about a hybrid. I think it's about what artists have always done. They will take whatever information they get, whatever technology they get, and they will create new art. And I think we saw a tremendous demonstration of that just before the break.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. Arthur Danto once said that art and artists are like weeds. They grow anywhere and they pick up anything, anywhere. And the truth is that out of that, true creativity comes. It's true.
Well, I don't know if I agree with you that there's not the respect and the ability to do true collaboration. I think you see one example of it right now here in New York in Warhorse, which
right.
really comes out of the Handspring Puppet Company from South Africa,
that
which is an
astonishing
organization. It's been an astonishing organization for quite a while. But I think we are starting to see more cross-boundary true collaboration.
No, I don't mean it doesn't exist, but I want to see more of that in a real, true collaborative way.
Takes money.
A la Silk Road. And it's money, absolutely. Money. So are you listening, Aaron, Lewis?
We're covered on the money.
Lowry, you had a hand up, and then there was another hand.
I just wanted to return to the eternal problem that we have of making arts more palpable and understandable to all those parents who wonder what the hell we're doing in our jobs. And I'm, having come back just from South Africa, I'm wondering if the models that we seem to be talking about are sort of art that would be produced and sort of be marketed in international fairs and have a kind of sort of global aspect to it. But I'm wondering if one cannot draw on just traditional arts that are being made in the villages everywhere as a way to sort of really describe the kind of viability. I mean, the thing that I was struck by in South Africa is that you could go to Monkey Biz, Streetwires, Ardmore, and you could sort of see a situation where you had a collaborative that had started at one point, but that a global awareness of where their project was going, the interaction with tourists and visitors to South Africa really produced a kind of increased sophistication so that there was this kind of growth to that. And, you know, we sort of downgrade these things and call them craft, you know, the big evil C word. Now that I'm at MAD, I'm sort of very sensitive about these things. And so I'm just wondering, you know, like if we're thinking about sort of promoting it, and I think in South Africa they don't realize how much they are promoting the crafts with the other art because they have to find some way to justify, you know, the artistic presence of a range of people, of a range of abilities, and a range of contexts. So I just wanted to sort of stick that in and just sort of wonder, are we just creating another kind of global market that becomes very essentialized and it all looks the same, and whether it's Ivo Barata or it's, you know, Subodh Gupta or somebody, it's all kind of has this kind of international look that we're familiar with, but there are other ways and means that we can build audiences for these arts and also a global market for them.
Pluyun, you might have a thought on that.
I think I'm sharing really this idea of really understanding what is the value of the arts, and I think the context is also, in a way, it's different from each nation. And each of us have to have that understanding, but there's a common sense of how the arts really serve humanity, and that's why I think it's my share on this will be really like I think what you thought is so.
Yeah, I think that partly what you're saying is that something Lewis started with, which is that we're really at this tremendous time of flux in our world. And that also means that we in the West, especially sitting in New York, have to recognize that we too can learn something from the process. It's not like we have it all. Yes, there are certain things we know how to do. We know about arts administration. We do know about funding. But the truth is, as Michael said, to get the essential quality of the spiritual quality of art that he got at Sufi Shrine, that you might not be able to get here. How do we stay open to breaking our own notions of what is art? I mean, I'll never forget 20 years ago when we started doing contemporary art at the Asia Society, as you remember well, and it was a very well-known curator, a male curator in New York, who said, how could there be any contemporary art? Because if there was any good contemporary art from Asia, I would have seen it. This is a quote, I mean that. And today, with the economic might of China and India, we're in a different place. The world has changed in 20 years, but the reality is that we do have to really stay open to those possibilities. Last question. Oh my God, there's lots of hands. You right there.
Hi, I was really taken this morning when Teddy Cruz talked about the reconfiguration of social and political relationships. And I am trying to apply that framework to this discussion. And I would like to just hear your thoughts about how the work you're doing is reconfiguring these relationships, and not with institutions. It seems it's a lot more difficult to think about how it's not reinforcing status quo power relationships.
I would come to you and then Michael. It's an interesting question, actually. Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand the question. Is the power shift of the relationship?
Well, meaning the physical spaces. How can we think about institutions in a global context that actually are not just reinforcing top-down power relationship, but from other ways recreate other kinds of spaces, which obviously you're trying to do in Cambodia.
But arts always has started with community first.
Right.
I think it's never been like Michael said, is institutions. It's always started from a grassroots. It's always started with initiative, local initiative, and I think it's the way this will be. It's not a shift. It's always have been that, and it will be always that also. And I think even I was talking to people here in the United States. I saw that also emerging from community in Vermont and other small local area where the craft starting to come back and all of this. So I think this is something that is always related and should be always related.
Well, you clearly have two different examples. You have Living Arts of Cambodia that comes from the community based up, and you have Doha that's really top down, that is reinforcing the structure of the government in a way.
I mean, I think arts was before the Wahhabi sects, started in the Arabian Gulf. It was from the bottom up.
Right.
But I mean, it was killed when the Wahhabi sect was in force, and trying to make the community aware, to reconnect. And to say, that art was always here. There's nothing wrong with expressing yourself through art. And in the Arabian Gulf, it wasn't really the visual arts that was prominent, right, but more of the poetry and the oral
literary tradition,
right? Literary tradition. So making that connection, and we're doing that. I mean, we have a whole education center at the museum that's dedicated to reconnecting with the community through these ways.
So it's almost like that is the transgressive act, is to say we're going to go beyond the Wahhabi influence in Doha. I'm afraid our time is up, but I hope that you found the conversation illuminating and much more to come. Thank you very much.